For about 150 years, Colorado's prisons have locked up some of history's best outlaw stories. From the lawless West to America's toughest prison today, Supermax. The state's relationship with crime and punishment started even before statehood and includes a cannibal, an 11-year-old murderer, prison breaks, and one of the most ruthless wardens in recent memory. Through it all, Colorado's first prison, nicknamed Old Max, remains a beautifully preserved testament to how we have built the walls of justice. From the state's first prison to today's Prison Valley, Cañon City has always been the place to call home if you're a criminal behind bars or one who keeps those bars closed. Walk into Colorado's first prison for a rare glimpse of law and order from the inside. It turns out, these walls can talk.
This program was made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional support from these organizations and viewers like you. Thank you.
After gold was discovered in the Colorado Territory in 1858, tens of thousands of men flooded into the West. With that rush came crowding, chaos, and crime. But there weren't yet any prisons to house the additional influx of scoundrels and scofflaws, giving the area a lawless reputation. This was a problem for those dreaming of statehood.
Colorado was interested in becoming a state. It needed to represent itself to the United States of America as a lawful place.
One of the things that Congress did was notice that prisons are part of the understanding at the time of what a civilized society was. We have to see the creation of a territorial prison in the bigger picture of what do you have as a unit of American society that is a civilized place and shows that reputable, ambitious people want to live there. So you should get going on a university. You should get going on choosing your capital and getting that set up in a very respectable manner, that this will be a place of solid and sober governance. A prison is a part of that.
When we think about why Coloradoans wanted a major incarceration facility in Cañon City or anywhere in the latter years of the 19th century, some of that has to do with local needs.
We can't take it for granted that incarceration was just what people always did to respond to crime or to lawlessness or to troubling behavior. First territorial governor, William Gilpin, is one of those people who says, boy, there's too many men in this population. A mining community, you have a lot more men than you have women. It's unbalanced. Too many men detached from families. This is going to be disorderly. This is going to be a threat to property. This is going to rattle us in every way. So we must take a stand against this lawlessness. There's a process of deliberation in the United States. Philadelphia and New York were the centers of that, of saying, what should we do as a society when people have gone outside our boundaries and behaved in ways that we want them to stop? We want them to give that up and not do that anymore.
It was an important part of the application portfolio to become one of the United States for Colorado to have an incarceration facility of the sophistication or the vision of statewide law keeping that states further back east had developed in the prior decades. The federal government moved into the Rocky Mountain states, establishing prisons to just set order on the landscape.
Congress then passes a law to support the creation of territorial prisons. Colorado is quick on the draw and gets into action very fast, leads other territories in proposing to Congress that they should have a territorial prison.
A Cañon City attorney and Territorial legislator, Thomas Macon, led the drive to locate the new Colorado prison in Cañon City. Happily for Macon's ambitions, planning for the first prison happened at about the same time as the debate over where the state capital would be located.
He was in the situation to do some vote trading. Denver wants the capital, Golden wants the capital, so Thomas Macon plays a part in saying, I'll help Denver. And then if he helps Denver, then a lot of other people then have to do something for him. Once Denver gets that capital, then Thomas Macon has a lot of cards to play to say Southern Colorado deserves that prison. So Cañon City gets the Territorial prison.
Another supporter of building a penitentiary in Fremont County, Jonathan Draper, donated a 25-acre parcel of land for the new prison. So supporters looking for economic opportunity now had a location and a beginning.
1868, there's drawing of plans, and there's scaling the plans down to meet the available money, and then there's looking for contractors who will take that and choosing among them and having some of them withdraw and give up, and then the actual start of construction. So it's quite a production to get it going. First prisoner, 1871, so that's pretty fast.
The original cell house was built out of stone that was actually quarried from right behind the facility, and the inmates are the ones who built the wall.
I think one of the most striking things to people who visit the Museum of Colorado Prisons, for instance, is to look at photographs of Territorial, which is a stone building in its earliest form without a wall.
They purposely did not put a wall around the initial cell house because they thought that most of the inmates would be working on ranches. In fact, there was a sign that said, "Be back by sundown or the doors would be locked."
The boundaries of the prison were much more permeable than they are now. And in fact, many inmates, or convicts, as they were called in those times, went back and forth into town as trustees, had jobs in town.
But that didn't work out well because they were causing mayhem. In fact, they had an escape early on where inmates overpowered the guard and took some weapons and were running amok around in Fremont County. The public was outraged.
By 1875, a wall suddenly seemed like a pretty good idea, and the first one was built around the compound.
When they were talking about what the cost of the wall would be and the labor that it would entail, they knew they already had a quarry, so they used the stone from that same quarry. We have this beautiful stone wall. And in that stone wall, we've got several stones that have carvings on them, along with inmate numbers. We have a hand with a heart in the center. We've got a couple of arrowheads, people writing their names and numbers in the stone.
Once the wall went up, a very interesting assortment of lawbreakers ended up in the Colorado State Penitentiary, including Alfred Packer. In the winter of 1874, Packer and a group of prospectors had found themselves in a desperate situation, trapped by severe weather in the San Juan Mountains. Packer was the only one to survive. His companions were found murdered. He never actually confessed to the murder of his companions, but Packer did admit to cannibalizing them.
What hasn't been said about Alfred Packer? He was originally convicted of murder and was sentenced to death. But there was a little loophole, so they had to retry him. Instead of putting him up for another murder charge, he had already admitted to killing one of the miners. They convicted him on manslaughter. So he was in prison not for cannibalism, not for murder, but for manslaughter.
Though the Colorado State Penitentiary has typically been reserved for adult offenders like Packer, in 1893, 11-year-old convicted murderer Anton Wood was considered too dangerous to be housed at a reform school, so he was placed behind bars in Cañon City.
He was 10 when he committed the crime of murder that he admitted to, and 11 when he was incarcerated at the Colorado State Penitentiary. Believe it or not, it's actually a success story. He was taken care of by the inmates. When he left prison at the age of 23, he was fluent in 3 different languages. He played the violin and piano so well, he actually taught other people how to play. One of his paintings was on display at the World's Fair. He was taken to Aurora, New York, to an artist commune where he taught other people how to play the violin. He fell in love with a young lady that he met on the Hudson River while he was drawing. She ended up being the daughter of a retired federal judge. They married, they moved to Minneapolis, where evidently he never had any interactions with the law.
When the prison first opened in 1871, the staff was small, 1 warden and 6 guards. And at that time, guards mainly handled keys rather than prisoners.
One of the sharpest contrasts between contemporary incarceration practices and historical ones is the role of correctional officers. In the early days, correctional officers were often elderly. It was not a particularly high-stress kind of environment. They were called turnkeys. They are seen in photographs alongside people in striped clothes. That's not so true now in a world in which there is undergraduate education for correctional officers. They are now trained to be not quite, but almost social workers in the sense that they are very supportive of the various kinds of rehabilitative programs. Part of their role is not just to keep everyone safe, but also to support the growth and rehabilitation of offenders.
Although prison guards in the late 1800s weren't concerned with reforming anyone, they had another problem: overcrowding. Convicts greatly outnumbered their accommodations. Authorities did add more buildings to the original prison site, but it was still woefully inadequate, especially for an influx of female prisoners.
Colorado Territorial Prison opened in 1871, and from that year until about 1900, there were only about 99 women incarcerated there. But in 1884, officials decided that they needed a separate space for women prisoners, and so 6 cells were built above the laundry and wash house area within the prison walls. In 1895, a separate building with about 40 cells was built just outside the prison walls, and that was enclosed within its own set of walls. In 1908, an additional building was built for female prisoners. This one had 40 cells and a space for kitchens, laundry, and washroom. During the territorial days, the prison was accepting female prisoners from other territories and states because some of those places didn't have the facilities to incarcerate some of the women who were accused of more serious crimes. Women prisoners really were kind of disproportionately punished in terms of their male counterparts, especially during the 19th century, during the Victorian era. Anything that a woman did that was sort of contradictory to the ideal of womanhood was really punished quite harshly. And especially women of color, women in economically disadvantaged situations, poorly educated women really felt the brunt of this sort of societal judgment.
Beyond the increase of women prisoners, a lack of adequate housing for all the convicts caused a constant state of overcrowding. In 1929, some of the prisoners decided it was intolerable, and they rioted. Led by convicted killer Danny Daniels, a group of convicts made demands that Warden F.E. Crawford would not accept. So the National Guard was brought in to try to end the chaos. In the end, it was the bloodiest prison rebellion in Colorado history. But just 3 years later, in 1932, there was a new warden in town.
The wardens have been major figures in Colorado history. And I think that the story of mid-20th century wardens is a great way to think about the history of incarceration in Colorado. Roy Best was such an amazing character, a larger-than-life sort of person, a harsh person in many ways, but in other ways a very warm person in that he took disabled inmates into his circle of affection.
There was a prisoner who had mental disabilities, who had committed a capital crime, and was going to be put to death. Roy Best really tried to help him and really tried to see if he could reduce that penalty.
With Roy Best as warden, prison life could be dramatic, practically right out of a movie. One suspenseful incident occurred in December 1947 when convicted murderer James Mad Dog Sherbandi led 11 other inmates on a daring escape. 2 inmates were killed and the others were recaptured. But that wasn't the end of the story.
Hollywood came calling. January of 1948. Really thought Escape was fascinating, wanted to show it on film. They billed the movie Cañon City as the very first docudrama. So they wanted permission to film inside the prison. It's an active prison. So they had to talk to Roy Best, and the story goes that Roy Best said, "I'll let you film in the prison as long as I get to play myself in the movie." Well, that was evidently agreed upon because they filmed inside the prison. Inmates were some of the extras, and Roy Best got to play himself in the movie. They actually flew him to New York City for the world premiere in June of 1948.
The film might have been called a docudrama, but it did not document some of Roy Best's management style. He was a great proponent of corporal punishment. To keep rule breakers in line, Best used a device called the Old Gray Mare. Offenders were bent over a sawhorse-like setup, thus the Old Gray Mare nickname. They were strapped down and flogged with a leather strap studded with tacks. Women prisoners were not subjected to the Old Gray Mare. By the 1930s, attitudes about female convicts had softened. Roy Best even wanted to build them a new facility.
In 1935, the Colorado Women's Prison, a separate entity, was built adjacent to the prison walls. This building had 30 cells on the main floor and then a basement with laundry, kitchen, the dining area.
You can look at the house-like women's incarceration facility. Homey is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but house-like isn't. And then turn around and look at the great wall separating the men's prison from the rest of the world and see that there's just a low stone wall around the women's prison. The assumption being that women are not about escape. I think the assumption behind that building in the 1930s was women were there because they were damaged. Their criminality was virtually medicalized. It was a disorder. And what this relatively healthful, house-like environment was going to do was bring them back into ordinary femininity. Women did some amount of gardening, but much of their energy was aimed toward cooking, textiles, sewing, making underwear for the men.
Yet, as needs for women prisoners changed over time, so did the facilities. In 1988, after a new, modern women's penitentiary was built, the old women's prison became a museum, a memorial to crime and punishment preserved with care.
In the rehabilitation from the prison to a museum, we kept all the cells. They're the original cells. The bars on the windows are the original bars on the windows. The kitchen is intact. The laundry room is the exact same appliances that were there when it was a functioning prison in 1935. The floor plan is basically the same.
The building is painted kind of an institutional green, and it looks really very similar to what it looked like when it was built in 1935. It's almost like walking back in time. The architectural style, the Mediterranean style, is really distinct for that time period. And so the preservation of the prison and the rehabilitation from an active prison to a museum are really important. The preservation of the museum really allows you to imagine what it would have been like to be incarcerated there.
The experience of being locked inside this prison depended greatly on who the warden happened to be. Wardens Wayne Patterson and Harry Tinsley had a distinctly lighter touch than Roy Best.
Tinsley had a different sense that explicit rehabilitation, that human engagement, rather than work and punishment, as had been Best's philosophy, would bring people back into the outside world. And some said then, and some would still say, that he was too nice, that he was too kind, that it wasn't effective. His compassion for the people with whom he was working, his sense that his real goal was rehabilitation, is vivid. And there are people alive in Cañon City today who remember that wardenship and remember the extraordinary shift to that rehabilitative model. Wayne Patterson followed in that pattern, and in general his policy as well was rehabilitative and educational.
Wayne Patterson definitely wanted people to know about the prison. He encouraged folks in Cañon City to learn about it by offering tours of the Colorado State Penitentiary. Through his whole tenure as warden into the mid-1970s, visitors could come into the prison and really walk through the cells and really see what it was like. He believed that the more people knew about the prison, the more they would support what was going on there.
Just down the hill from the old prison stands the deputy warden's house. Built in 1901 with stone from the same quarry that supplied the prison itself. The Queen Anne-style house features a dominating 3-story tower with an eye towards any trouble.
The house is outside the walls of the prison. If anything was to happen inside the walls, they couldn't take the deputy warden hostage, but they were close enough to respond to any problems that might occur. The deputy warden's house is definitely an iconic building here in Cañon City. A lot of people think it's the warden's home because it's so decorative. You'll see the stained glass, you'll see the stone creatures that are sitting out front, the original porch.
The Department of Corrections used the house from the mid-1970s to 2007 as housing for juvenile delinquents and administrative offices. It now sits vacant and in need of major restoration. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 2001 because of the architectural significance of its Queen Anne style. There are other examples of this architecture in the Cañon City area, but this house is unusual with its oversized tower and twin lions gracing the front walkway.
It's on Colorado's most endangered places list. We're working very hard with the Department of Corrections and the state to try and save the building. The bones are good. It just needs a little TLC.
Preserving the legacy of Colorado's first prison is considered an essential part of preserving the history of Colorado. The original west wall still stands, and several gun towers constructed in the 1920s remain, overseeing what is still an active penitentiary.
They're beautiful quarried stone. You can see where the original windows were. And then when they added the barbed wire and then razor wire, they extended those towers up to be higher. The Soda Springs Tower is very interesting. Just that it's beautiful. It's no longer being used because we no longer have a spring that the general public would come to. Early on in the 1800s, there was a soda spring, and people used to come from all around to drink from this spring. Since it's so close to the prison, they built a tower, and that tower was known as the Soda Spring Tower. So an officer used to stand in that tower to make sure the general public didn't try to come onto the prison land. We lost that spring in the 70s when Highway 50 was expanded.
Colorado's original prison no longer sits alone on a hill. Cañon City has grown right up to this stone fortress, and now there are many other places for criminals to reside in the area. 10 other state and federal facilities have joined Old Max in what's rightfully become known as Prison Valley.
The most important things about prisons are the questions we don't ask. It's easy to see what's there. It's not so easy to see what's behind the scenes. Who is in prison is the most important thing about prisons. And I think we learn that from looking at them across time. We want to know why people are there in order to understand both how they're best supported or might best re-enter society, and also to stop other people from having the kind of experience that brought them there. Incarceration is such a vivid element of the landscape of Colorado. My goodness, Florence, Cañon City. Wow, that's a lot of incarceration going on there.
Fremont County remains a place where a significant percentage of the population are inmates, and where an even larger portion of the population are people working for the prisons.
In the late 1800s, legislator Thomas Macon had a vision for his hometown. Macon's push to build the state's first prison in Cañon City proved to be very productive for his time and ours.